I think the issue of capital punishment is quite a sensitive one and raises issues which concern the very heart of the political society. Now, I think it's important to consider not changeable details, as is often done, but the very nature of the punishment and its relation to what we might term the body politic, which I think gives a clearer idea of why the Death Penalty Act, the Murder Act, which repealed the death penalty, should in itself be repealed, reinstating the death penalty. Now, I mentioned the term body politic. What do I mean by this? Well, just some background. So we wouldn't dispute that man lives in a web of interpersonal relations, and each of these webs, as it were, interconnect to form families, organizations, and societies. If we continue this line of thought, the wider web network is nestled in a hierarchy, and this can be discerned, quite easily. We always see there's a political hierarchy, and here there is a certain harmony and order in the complex network of relations, because criminal activity disrupts this harmony and order. We see that at the highest level, there's governments and institutions of law which exist, and now if I can mix metaphors, they form a sort of head to the body of society. As such, we may conceive of ourselves in a way as members of this body. Well, very well. What should we do if one of these members or limbs is diseased? Of course, we procure means for their cure. As such, we may in no way deny the necessity of rehabilitation and remedial penalties. Indeed, who can deny that it's a great benefit for a wicked person to enter prison and leave it, having been provided with education and work in prison, as we do now, giving GCSEs, NVQs, and thereby such persons, having been criminal, re-enter society as more productive persons. However, we all recognize that there are certain criminals who are beyond reform. Their crimes are so heinous that, well, even though there may be a hypothetical possibility of reform, they just won't reform, and we see this throughout history. There are just people who never reformed. For this, we have whole life orders for the worst murderers, and as of last June, there were 65 such offenders. And such as these shall never be released unless exceptional circumstances should arise. Good. But allow me to pursue the notion of the body politic further. A limb may be diseased and curable. Its damage may be contained even. But it's not true that, for example, but is it not true rather, in our natural bodies, it's sometimes necessary to amputate a limb to allow for the health of the whole. Just to clarify, I don't think we're animatronic limbs, but it is a metaphor which I think is helpful. Well, what's true for the natural body seems also true for the body politic, this body which we call society. It is not sure that the very worst criminals may experience some subjective reform of their character, but it is certain that the whole community of the nation will bear the objective burden of human, physical, and monetary resources to sustain the continued existence in society, not explicitly, but certainly nestled in a social institution like a prison. It's provided by society to sustain the continued existence of these whom we have determined to be the worst and most destructive people among us. I mean, just consider the statistics. A single public sector prisoner may cost upwards of £52,000 per annum to maintain. And we speak very often of justice as rendering to another what is their due. Where is the justice in this? Are those innocent of any grievous legal wrong to be rendered the burden of sustaining the refuse matter of society? It seems that the abolition of the death penalty is the real public injustice, and not the other way around. It is better that 10 guilty persons escape, says Blackstone, than one innocent suffer. And this maxim has an ancient pedigree, being traceable to, just to survey authors of our own jurisdiction, to Fortescue around 600 years ago. Who would dare contradict such a venerable saying? Doesn't it defeat any argument for the death penalty? Not quite. It rather indicates, in, I think, rather unhelpful hyperbole, that the rule of law, that the rules of law and of determining liability must be such that a miscarriage of justice be an unthinkable exception. Now, we haven't had capital punishment in this jurisdiction for a while, since at least 1964, but take, for example, India, which still has capital punishment. Now, in the 1994 case of Chatterjee, there were serious problems. The man was convicted of serious sexual offence and murder, and he was sentenced to death. The courts didn't consider material evidence, and it was not established beyond reasonable doubt that he truly committed the offence. And in 2004, this man was executed. This is true, and such problems can arise, but this doesn't mean that the death penalty should not exist. It rather means that the rules of law should be such, on a statutory basis, so that there can be determined liability beyond reasonable doubt. Just because a good can be perverted does not mean a good is not a good. And for, to use sort of ancient terminology, for a fallen society, perhaps it is the right thing that certain of the worst criminals be put to death. Now, to quote an expression from that very Indian Supreme Court case, it is necessary, for cases that are rarest of the rare, it is necessary that if true justice be pursued, we have strong rules of law. Should the death penalty be reinstated, to allow for the punishment to be executed in a lawful and morally just fashion. And for these reasons, I would submit to you that the Murder Act of 1965 should be repealed and this penalty be reinstated. I think that those are the end of my remarks.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Charlie Webb, and I appear as lead counsel in this debate for the party objecting to the repeal of the Murder Act of 1965. I am accompanied in this instance by my learned friend Miss Paula Della Cava, who sits to my left, who will also be objecting. Members of the audience, there are three significant reasons why the reinstatement of the death penalty in England and Wales would be a dangerous reintroduction of an archaic law. Firstly, the enormous risk of executing innocent people in miscarriages of justice. The statistical evidence, which clearly proves that capital punishment is not an effective form of deterrence. And finally, our submission that the death penalty is not the best available form of retribution. I begin on my point of miscarriages of justice with three poignant names taken from British legal history. Those are the names of Derek Bentley, Timothy Evans, and Edith Thompson. These are three innocent individuals wrongly put to death in instances of miscarriages of justice prior to the implementation of the Murder Act 1965. I now turn to a further list of names: the Birmingham Six, the Guildford Four, Sally Clark, Angela Cannings, and Stefan Kitchko. The difference here, ladies and gentlemen, is that many of the 13 names that I have just read, who were also wrongly convicted of murders which they did not commit, many of these people are still alive today solely because they received their sentences after capital punishment had been abolished in England and Wales. Please consider, members of the audience, that any one of the names that I have listed could have been a family member of yours. Now question, what would your stance on the re-implementation of capital punishment be if a family member or a friend could die at the hands of the state despite being innocent? And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the inherent risk which accompanies the practice of capital punishment. In the United States alone, 130 people have been exonerated from death row in the past 51 years. That's almost 3 people, on average, per year, whose lives were endangered at the hands of the state solely for the purpose of having a system of capital punishment in place. And so, ladies and gentlemen, those are the clear risks associated. But what about the rewards of having a system in place that my learned friend may wish to point to in the debate? It may be the case that my learned friend suggests that the repeal of the Murder Act will have some sort of deterrent value. However, members of the audience, statistics taken from the United States in 2015 clearly show that there is a 25% higher murder rate in states in the US which practice the death penalty. It is our submission that rather than deterring crime, capital punishment actually brutalizes the law, showing the legal system as a framework which is content with taking the lives of others. The death penalty is not a deterrent. The thought of being caught and imprisoned is. The taxpayers' money that would be wasted on the re-implementation of capital punishment in England and Wales could be otherwise used to the benefit of actual deterrence. For example, strengthening our police force and building more prisons, providing a true deterrence. It is also our submission, ladies and gentlemen, that capital punishment is no better a form of retribution than a sentence of life imprisonment. Not only is a death sentence the easy way out for a convicted murderer, but it is also not what the public want. In a democratic society, where only 40% of public voters are in favour of the re-implementation of the death penalty, how can we expect a jury whose decision it will be whether to impose a death penalty or not to do so consistently if the public consensus does not fall in favour? And if a person is unaware as to whether his crimes will attract a death sentence prior to committing them, then how can it be any form of deterrence? Members of the audience, our justice system in England and Wales is good, but it is not infallible. Jurors are human beings like you and I, capable of making mistakes or being swayed by personal bias. Defence barristers, judges, and expert witnesses are capable of making errors. And when the risk of miscarriages of justice are present, execution should never be an option. Members of the audience, it is for the reasons that I have outlined that we firmly oppose the repeal of the Murder Act 1965. Thank you.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Paula de la Calva, and I'm the Junior Counsel of the opposing party on the repeal of the Murder Act 1965. As it's been mentioned by Mr. Webb, this topic is of serious importance and should be treated as such, so that we leave today understanding what it would mean if we were to repeal the Murder Act and the benefits if we don't. This evening, I'll be drawing attention to additional topics other than miscarriages of justice, as my dear friend mentioned, and will focus on the impact on repealing the Murder Act that will have on human rights. In addition, I will also talk about how there will be a risk of injustice through discrimination, and finally, the costs that would come as a result of reinstating the death penalty. But first, we must consider the meaning of the Act itself. The first sentence states, "No person shall suffer death for murder, and that a person convicted of murder shall be sentenced for life imprisonment." Take a second to understand what this means, and take a second to analyze what the Murder Act does for us in society. Because the answer is simple. It shows a solution to a problem that we had a century ago and we have now fixed. So what is the point of repealing this now? And the even better question, why shouldn't we? To start us off, the Murder Act has enabled advancements on human rights and built the stepping stones towards true abolition, which we saw in 1998 through the Human Rights Act. In addition, it also protects individuals and particularly protects Article 2 and 3 of the ECHR, which is the freedom of life and freedom from inhuman and degrading treatment. As a result, it has protected the most vulnerable in society and has allowed for justice to take its place. It has also allowed victims of these atrocities to be exonerated and their stories be heard. The story of Mahmoud Matan is one of them. In 1952, he became the prime suspect in a murder investigation of Lily Volper. There was a lack of evidence placing him at the scene of the crime, and most witness statements were disclosed, relying on one single prosecution witness to make the final decision. Because of this, he paid the price and was hanged in March of 1952. It only came to light 45 years later that he was innocent, and the Court of Appeal quashed the conviction. That is 45 years for innocence to be shown in Matan's case. But it won't change the fact that his life was very literally taken away from him. In addition to Matan's story, there are others around the world which this is still currently happening to. This is countries that still have capital punishment and don't have the protection that we offer through the Murder Act. Countries such as Japan, China, USA, all countries we consider to have democracies. But ask yourself, what is democratic about that? There are reports by the ACLU in America stating that 1 in 5 individuals are on death row. These are poorly represented. In 2022, there are reports that 2,500 were convicts on death row, and there was an average of 18 people being executed yearly in the United States. Compared to other figures, you might think this isn't a lot, but when looking at the value of life, individuals every year are facing long trials, are going through emotional distress, and are thinking if they will be one of those 18 who have had their lives taken forever. Repealing the Murder Act would bring this to the UK, and it would disrupt human rights and, more importantly, create chaos in society. Parliament fought 36 years before they could pass the Murder Act, and since then there has been a lack of demand, knowing that the benefits of keeping the Murder Act just as it is protects all of us and through the law. When looking at why the Murder Act shouldn't be repealed, we must also consider how it protects those who have been previously discriminated upon during the process of executing capital punishment. It would become a risk to justice itself and allow for natural human biases, which we all have. However, the difference is these specific biases would allow for people to be executed. To this day, class remains an issue in the justice system, and it is seen in other countries with the death penalty. It is recognized by the United Nations of Human Rights, and as a matter of fact, in 2017, they stated, if you are poor, the chances of being sentenced are immensely higher than if you are rich, thus making it equivalent to an arbitrary killing. In addition to class, countries like the US deal with race as a significant factor. The United States General Accounting Office said that 82% of the victim studies reviewed showed that race was found to influence the likelihood of being charged with capital murder. This shows that the odds are against the people, and so is the system, where class and race will always play a part. But it is our responsibility to prevent this and protect the people through the law. This is something we wouldn't be able to confidently offer if the Murder Act were to be repealed, which is why leaving it untouched is more beneficial to our country and society. Last but not least, I'm going to briefly mention the cost benefits of keeping the Murder Act untouched because of the current legal system structure, as opposed to repealing it and adding on another problem. Whereas the economy has been demonstrated to be a key priority for our government, the well-being of prisoners has yet to present itself as an immediate concern. As of this current year, it was recorded by the UK prison population statistics that 60% of prison establishments are crowded. In addition to that, individuals are already dying in a prison system which we don't take care of them. It is shown by the Director of Inquest, Deborah Coles, which found that in 2021, 371 people died in England and Wales prisons behind doors, which was the highest poll since records began. Being aware of this severe problem, would any of you purposely put us in this situation? In addition to the current state of prison systems left unsolved, the current government would, under a hypothetical situation, have to retrain judges, retrain lawyers, and have to make buildings larger to allow death row prisoners. It is not viable and would take a large percentage of taxpayer money when there is no demand. The most recent poll by the government was in 2002, and they asked whether we should bring back the death penalty. It only achieved 12,000. When looking at not only the humanitarian side, but the practicality of repealing the Murder Act, the reasonable person would agree that the Murder Act shouldn't be repealed, and so should you. Thank you.
Thank you for your opening statements. Before we enter into the second half of our debate with the open format, I would like to submit the request that the speakers allow Harsh to make the first input in this second half owing to the difference in team size.
Can you hear me? I think I can hear myself. Okay. Now I can be heard. Okay, good. Hopefully the technology works. There were several comments on your side, and there were some good points. So, now your speech, you mentioned the sort of the the idea that one should place one's relatives in this situation, and then there's been several miscarriages of justice. What would be the percentages? So what is the proportion of the miscarriage as opposed to there being generally agreed that these were soundly concluded? Do you have to turn it on?
Right. In terms of the percentages, I don't know them off the top of my head. I can tell you that it would definitely be the majority of cases were concluded in the correct way, with the correct person being convicted of the crime which they're accused. But the problem that our side has is that one person being wrongly executed or wrongly accused of a crime, convicted of it, and then being put on death row with the thought of having to be executed, even if they are later exonerated, that's one too many. So it's not our submission that it's a common thing that takes place every day. It might only be that someone's wrongly convicted of a crime once every year. But the problem is, as soon as they are executed for that crime they did not do, it will undermine the whole system.
Okay, I think I can be heard a bit better. I would submit that while the rules of law can never provide a perfect solution, there can be investigations to determine whether a better mode of more surely determining liability can be established. And I think the somewhat utilitarian argument would be in favor of my side as opposed to your side, in as much as these persons, I mean, there was a mention of costs. Such persons having forfeited their right to be within society, removing them is a better idea than sustaining their continual existence. And I think I may be forgiven for not addressing the deterrence point, because that wasn't one I considered material to my side. Deterrence is an important factor, but my concern was rather the drag these people have in terms of the costs, because they are, as I've said, refuse matter in society. If I may switch slightly to your, so you mentioned the protection of human rights.
Yes.
I think, be allowed to be so bold, there was a logical error in your argument at the beginning, because you said it allows for the better protection of rights, but you presumed that capital punishment would be a violation of one's rights. Now, I mean, legally, one may say, okay, capital punishment is a violation of such a right, but surely this is not the appropriate way of dealing with it, because if we're going to have a meta-legal analysis, there's a moral basis, and it has not been established that capital punishment is inherently evil. And considering that a human right would be based on these natural rights, I would dispute the fact that capital punishment truly violates any rights at all, unless it be a miscarriage.
So I can reiterate that. So it is not necessarily capital punishment, which is what is a violation of human rights, but as you've mentioned, miscarriages of justice is, and also the way that it is determined. So it is said by international law that it is only the most punishable and extreme cases that should be determined with capital punishment. So there's different countries, such as the US, that, for example, have convicted people and put them on death row because of drugs. So would you agree that drugs is necessarily punishable by death, selling drugs, consuming drugs? So if you need further information with that, I can provide that now, or if you want to.
No, I think I would agree with the, well, even though it was wrongly decided, the Indian Supreme Court in the case which I cited, Chatterjee, it's 1994, in as much as the rarest of the rare, that's a quote from the case, the rarest of the rare cases should be decided on a capital punishment basis. And the determination of the liability of that person was one of these rarest of rare cases.
Firstly, on the concept of human rights, yesterday, the state of Alabama executed an inmate on death row using nitrogen gas. They did this because he'd previously had a botched lethal injection. Do you not think, when they're not getting it 100% right every time, and potentially an inmate could be either in pain prior to death or in pain so that the execution has to stop, do you not think that that is somewhat a contravention of a human right?
Do you mean to ask the mode of execution?
The mode not being one that is effectively putting a person to sleep in a painless manner, in an easy way. Instead, they're having to stop the executions.
Certainly. And this is why I prefer the method that was used in this jurisdiction of the trapdoor hangings, which would snap your neck. And that is the most painless mode of execution so far as I am aware. And if we're going to dispose of the refuse of society, the worst of the worst, might as well do it efficiently.
I'd also like to touch upon the costs element. So to give you some statistics, New Jersey spent $253 million over a 25-year period and had no executions. Not only would I say that that's extremely expensive, especially when you're not executing anyone, and a massive waste of public taxpayer money, but also, do you not think we could have the potential where we are executing people who there are claims of innocence of, solely because we've spent so much money having them on death row for so many years, that adds some sort of political pressure?
I think I would refer to the first few comments in my speech, where I said, where I said there are matters, if I can, use a sort of scholastic term, accidental and essential. So there's the essence of the punishment being at question, and not factors that may attach to it, but they can be remedied. I would submit to you that this is one of those factors that can be remedied. It is not necessary that someone be on death row for 20 years, 30 years, 40 years. That's not necessary. Someone can be on death row for a very short time, a few months even. And having, as I suggest, there be good means in law. After deliberation, we don't want to rush these things, re-implementing the capital punishment. Having these safeguards and then efficiently proceeding with capital punishment, I would submit to you, is a much better way than the method pursued in the United States, where, as is quite infamous, and as you point out, there are millions and millions of dollars and many, many years being wasted in barbarity.
So your point, in essence, is that in order to save money and not spend like the US do, we could execute in a slightly faster way. I'm just going to give you some names with some years, and I don't expect you to know anything about the cases potentially, but I'm just going to give you some statistics. So a gentleman called Barry White served 6 years for murder. The Cardiff Five served 2 years. Sally Clark served 4 years. Barry George served 8 years. These people didn't serve very long at all and were exonerated. Some people served a lot longer. Stefan Kitchko was 16, Robert Brown was 25. The problem is that with your idea of executing people early into their sentences, many of these people could have died because they wouldn't have had long enough to have appeals. You've got potential political pressures of money, not wanting the appeals to go ahead because they want to execute these people. Do you not think that we need a system where, if we were to have capital punishment, it would have to be over a very long process so they could get enough appeals in and see if there's any fresh evidence?
I see you're trying to box me in. I see you're trying to box me in. First of all, I don't think it's particularly helpful to name the cases, because it's not, it doesn't reach the essence of the argument. If you could repeat the...
Effectively, You're saying that it would be a lot cheaper if we executed people a lot faster. But if we execute people a lot faster, you don't give enough time for fresh evidence to come out and potentially prove their innocence. So you could be executing more innocent people.
I would dispute that as a characterization of my position. It's somewhat accurate, but not entirely accurate. Now, if we have means, if we have for the worst crimes, so murder, especially murder, if we determine the liability on a surer footing beforehand, then I believe we can prevent the necessity for appeal. And furthermore, granted that there are miscarriages, I think society is still better off on a whole that we allow that there may be a possibility for miscarriages, not desiring it, but that these persons are disposed of nonetheless. But I would also add that if there is a surer footing for determining liability to prevent it going to appeal in a larger portion of cases than was previously the case, then we can implement capital punishment without a long process, and therefore also ensure that that my desire for a shorter period between conviction and execution be actually enacted.
So, as we mentioned, there's no demand by the public necessarily at the moment in the UK. How would you argue that it should be repealed? Do you think it should be imposed by the government, or what would your approach be with that?
Well, if I may be allowed to dispute that, there has been a decrease in public appetite, but it's, so far as I'm aware, the last statistics indicate that there's at least 50%. I mean, allow me to be corrected, but at least.
I believe it was 46.
46.
Yeah, around the 40s.
Yeah.
Around 10% undecided.
Yeah.
And about 50 in favour of not having.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think we're on fairly even grounds here. And I don't necessarily think those who are undecided would come on your side, because we don't know where they would stand. So I don't think, at least in this particular instance, public opinion is quite material to the determination of the present question. Now, if the statistics were to change significantly, so that we can be sure that it's not going to swing to there not being capital punishment, we don't want capital punishment at all, then I would certainly concede to the entire argument, because a punishment cannot be imposed upon a society which does not desire it. That would be almost tyrannical. But as the question presently stands, I think public opinion should not be considered as defeating the argument in favour of reinstating capital punishment.
Quite a frank question. How many innocent lives are, in your opinion, worth sacrificing for the re-implementation of the death penalty?
How many innocent lives are worth sacrificing?
What I mean is, if one innocent person, if it was to be re-implemented, and one innocent person found innocent after execution, would we get rid of it then?
Well, I think you're making a point similar to Blackstone's ratio, which I referenced to, that it is better for 10 guilty to be released than for one innocent. And I think the essence of that idea is that the systems of law should be such that we can ensure that no innocent be ever wrongly convicted. Who can give a numbers idea? I wasn't going on numbers. I was saying that means that we should have a better way of establishing criminal liability, and if that means that there's a longer trial, so be it. It was never suggested that we would love for 50,000 persons to be wrongfully executed. Oh, this is perfectly fine. We are some sort of ancient barbarians with no sense of propriety. I'm firmly in the English legal tradition in this, and mind you, Blackstone and Fortescue and all these people who have made the point in your vein, which you're developing against capital punishment, they were all in favor of capital punishment. It's not necessary that a civilized society not remove amputated limbs. Do not, I mean, if I may continue that analogy, one might misdiagnose it. It may not be necessary that this amputation go ahead. Well, that given, should we prevent all amputations? I think that would be a foolish suggestion to make, because the exception need not defeat the general existence of the rule. I think the argument against capital punishment, if I mean, not to insult your side, I respect your side, is more emotively rooted than it is objectively rooted. And by this I mean it is appealing to the sense of the affective sense that, oh, I do not want this person to be killed, which I think comes in the listing of names and the rhetorical strategy. Perfectly fine. We don't want, Mr. Smith to be killed if he's innocent. But that doesn't vitiate the utilitarian point which I was making about the usefulness of liquidating the worst members of society.
But isn't the problem that we're always going to be stuck on that people like Stefan Kitschko, and I know you've said not specifically to talk about each case, but I'll give a little insight. He was accused of killing a little girl. Is he not the sort of person who you'd be describing as one of the worst people in society? And then 16 years later, he's found to be innocent. But the problem is, people can appear to be the worst in society based on the evidence being wrong, the judge being wrong, the jury getting it wrong, or even the police doing something on purpose. The problem you're going to get is the worst members of society might appear as that, but they might actually be innocent.
No, that's quite true. What may be seeming true may not be true in truth. That's a point which I have conceded. I don't think it's particularly useful to bring it up again. I would revert to the position that there may be miscarriages, but on the whole, it is a better idea for capital punishment to be reinstated on a surer footing. So someone may be the worst, someone may not be the worst. This is the case which I referred to, the Indian Supreme Court case. And I keep referring back to it because I think it's particularly illustrative of the dangers of capital punishment, as well as the potential advantages of capital punishment. And I see the advantages come from the failures of the courts in that case. The courts failed because, if I may go into the facts of that case, the man who was accused, he didn't have a sure alibi of that time, except the person who was attacked. There were signs, there was a struggle. There were no signs of a struggle on him. The victim was a daughter. The parents had it out for this man, as it were, and they provided circumstantial evidence. The courts never considered their testimony. They never tested their testimony. It was just taken as it were to be correct. These are grave injustices. Who cannot? Why should we not consider evidence in a sober manner, and thereby not present a narrative that presents someone who may be potentially innocent as guilty. Well, how do we do that? Well, we have correct methods of determining someone's liability, and that's fine. And there may be an error. Okay, errors happen, and we should work towards the eradication. Doesn't mean that there be a long drawn-out process. Doesn't mean that there be not capital punishment. All imperfect societies, and no society can be perfect, will make errors. It's a matter of, on balance, do we really want to be supporting, £52,000 a year? And as you've already conceded, most of these cases can be correctly decided, and were correctly decided, probably. Otherwise, we would have a failed criminal justice system. So I would say the costs and benefits argument weighs more heavily on my side.
I'm going to make my final point and then I'm going to pass on because I don't want to hog the mic for too long. You talk about the worst people in society, and we've been over this and stuff, and let's say I'm with you on that. In the United States, the jury get to decide whether a case is for death penalty or not. What if someone commits, as happens in America, there are people on death row who have killed one or two people. Sometimes they've killed police officers. There are people serving life imprisonment who have committed school shootings. What would you say if I were to say that having jurors, as they do, decide death sentences might not be very consistent, and therefore you might find that it's not the worst people who are on death row, it's somewhat the unlucky, yet callous, but unlucky murderers, as opposed to the ones who truly deserve to be on death row?
I entirely agree with you, and I believe that supports my argument, because I am not one to trust, your ordinary citizen, though they may be upstanding, though they may have sober judgment. I am not one to say, let's give them free rein in determining liability. So, if I may, well, you've given me a perfect opportunity. Look, I said statutory rules earlier. Well, we can say, okay, certain crimes should, for example, school shootings. This is such a crime that there should be capital punishment. If we are clearer and saying only these crimes apply, then perhaps we may eradicate the problem that exists in the United States, a jurisdiction, as you have pointed out, as suffers from severe problems. We may eradicate the problems we see in other jurisdictions and allow for, if I may requote that expression, the rarest of the rare cases to be executed. And rarest of the rare, the Supreme Court of India never said what is rarest of the rare, but surely our sober MPs may determine what categories are rarest of the rare.
Just to move on from that, so you mentioned human bias. I'm sure you would agree that human bias is something that we cannot remove, but wouldn't you agree that by having capital punishment, human bias has such a long-term effect? You can't bring back life once it's taken. However, having life imprisonment or other options and alternatives, you do have that option to be corrected. So how is having capital punishment helping human bias from an objective point?
Could I ask you to clarify what you mean by human bias?
So human bias in terms of the justice system and in terms of executing prisoners.
I would rather there be a more objective way. So, as I just mentioned, the bias of jurors, or the the caprice of jurors, or the differences between one jury and the next jury. So, jury A may decide, let's have capital punishment. Jury B may decide, we do not want capital punishment. Well, let's not give them an option in deciding whether or not capital punishment is appropriate, in as much as a parliament would require them to, if such a crime, if such a person is determined as to be responsible for example, a school shooting, well, they have no option but to decide capital punishment. That if person X is guilty, he must necessarily be found, found liable to be punished capitally.
Would you not say even Parliament is a victim of human bias? Even politicians, even all of these people involved that would make all these rules, they are still going to be victims of human bias. So these people making the rules, just because it's written down doesn't mean it's always abided. So let's say, yes, school shooters will be executed and others will not. That might be in theory correct, but in practice, it won't necessarily be the same. So we're going to go back in a cycle and have the same problem. So how is that going to be fixed in your eyes?
I think that's only a sort of verbal objection. I mean, with all due respect, I don't think it's an objection which carries much weight, because all human law, all human political decisions are contingent upon a human mind. So your side may be subject to human bias, my side may be subject to human bias. We have to make a decision at some point. And if we don't subject it to the immediate caprice of jurors, but if we subject it to, okay, we have this meta legal reflection, this the metafactual reflection, as it were, and if we distill certain concrete statutory rules, then perhaps we may reduce the unhelpful bias that is found. I mean, you said in was it Alabama?
Yeah.
Or so, these sort of cases. It's not necessary. As I was saying, the essence of capital punishment is not attacked by these arguments. I think I think the arguments that your side are making are very helpful in establishing a surer basis for the reintroduction of capital punishment. So I think you should really come onto my side and be arguing in favor of capital punishment.
I'm going to put two different things to you. Firstly, I'm going to say that the English legal system is pretty strong. In fact, it's renowned for being what we think one of the best in the world. And yet, miscarriages of justice still happen. So I'm going to suggest, and you can rebut me on this, that no matter what changes we make to our legal system, which is already meant to be very strong, it's not going to stop miscarriages of justice from happening. And I'm also going to say with that, how does executing people provide any worse of a sentence than making them suffer the consequences of their actions in prison for the rest of their life?
Could you repeat? Okay. Could you repeat the first question?
So the first question was, just thinking back now. Oh, we have a very good justice system in England and Wales. I'm putting it to you that it will never be at a better stage so that we can guarantee that miscarriages of justice won't happen.
Okay, that's perfectly fine. I think it's a hypothetical. Miscarriage of justice may or may not happen. I was arguing on balance, especially from a utilitarian perspective, it is much better. And capital punishment, I would put to you, if executed in the way I've outlined, saving time on a better basis would not only liquidate these members of society, but also save much money. I mean, I was saying 52,000 per year for the public sector prison. So on those bases, I would argue that those objections do not hold force.
I understand that we're out of time, but I would just say that as far as I'm aware, the drugs required of course, you suggest hanging, which I personally don't think would be something that the British public would agree with. But if we were to go down the lethal injection route, they would be extremely expensive. They are very hard to get hands on. And I think that would somewhat go against any cost-saving elements involved in not having life prisoners.
I thank the speakers for their contribution this evening, and I'll now leave it to our audience members to decide who has won, in their opinion, this opening debate.